welcome everyone again. Before we'll start to introduce our today's speaker, I want to say that the first lecture will be with a different way of interaction with the audience. So our speaker suggested that every 7 minutes, you will have a chance to interrupt the speaker and ask your questions and make a comments like agreement or disagreement with the speaker. So every time we will have the person who has to count 7 minutes and then to stop on the speaker. So I will do that the first. I will try to provide kind of the example how to do that. So when the speaker starts, I will count 7 minutes, and then I will stop the speaker and try to do a comment or ask a question. And then I will choose from our participants the next person. Is it correct, Talitha? That's a time watcher, yeah? Time watcher. So I will then ask someone from our participants to count 7 minutes and then to stop our speaker and to ask a question or to do some to make some comment. So that's something that we will try to do today. And if we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end of the lecture, so we will do that too. So I want to introduce our today's moderator, who will introduce our today's first speaker, the speaker of the 4th day of the summer school. So that's Roman Solovey, the rector of our institute and the chief editor of our journal. So Roman Solovey, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending in which part of the world you are. It's a pleasure to continue our Summer School of Theology. And it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our first speaker today. I will try to pronounce her name correctly. I guess it's kind of German French, maybe not. Talitha Cooreman-Guittin. Is it correct?
Not too bad. The French say Guittin, but I'll buy Guittin, don't worry.
Okay, thank you. She's a professor in practical theology at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, where she holds a chair in pastoral theology, religious pedagogy, and homiletics. And Talitha's research focuses on the conversation between disability and theology, with a keen interest in issues related to friendship. She published a lot of articles and other contributions, and also 2 books related to this topic. And Talitha has been happily married for more than 30 years and has 3 grown-up children. I invite Dr. Talitha to share her presentation with us today. I had the pleasure to read that presentation yesterday, and I have found it very enriching and stimulating, and I am praying, I'm hoping that you will find it the same way I did. So Talitha, the floor is yours. We are all eager to listen to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman, and thank you, Xenia, for this opportunity to be part of this quite amazing panel of lectures that you have managed to gather for the summer school. Hello to all of you, and let's go. I'm going to share my screen, which is always a moment of stress. It worked just fine 2 minutes ago, so it should work fine now too. Okay, there we go. There we go for a talk on the specific contribution of Roman Catholic theology to the development of theologies of disability. Because it is a very Roman Catholic topic, I have decided to focus my talk on the notion of magisterium. Indeed, the strong sense of magisterium is characteristic of Catholic thinking, and the pontificate of Francis has seen the development of quite an original form of magisterium, namely a magisterium of fragility. I believe this magisterium constitutes a valuable contribution to the development of theologies of disabilities, as it paves the way to disability leadership in our Christian churches. Of course, we do have to see how we understand the notion of leadership within Christianity. Do we understand it in the framework of power? And I'm showing a photo of the world's leaders at the G7 in Hiroshima summit in 2023. Is that what we understand as power? And is that the kind of power that we would want people with disabilities to be in? I'm showing a photo of 7 people with disabilities in a very similar pose to the one that I've just shown on the Hiroshima summit. Or should we as Christians perceive of disability leadership and maybe leadership in general more in this way? And I have asked Brian Brock to share this photo with me. Those who were with us on the first day surely remember the photo of Bishop Anne with Caleb and Adam, who are Brian's elder children, and with Adam, who has Down syndrome, leaning heavily on the shepherd's cross of Bishop Anne. I think this photo comes really as a godsend to me to introduce this talk about disability leadership in the Catholic Church. In my presentation, I will outline how this magisterium of fragility is slowly developing in the thought of Pope Francis and in the praxis of the Church. And my aim is to question whether this magisterium creates a space for disability leadership within the Catholic Church. So I'll give you a short introduction on the notion of magisterium as we understand it in the Catholic Church. I will describe the development of the magisterium of fragility. I then seek to engage the conversation between this magisterium of fragility and the works of a few disability theologians. And then I would like to see with you how this teaching is paving the way for disability leadership to be put in practice in the Catholic Church. As I said, I am using one of the Tyagi learning techniques. You can look at other techniques at the website that is at the bottom of this slide. So as Xenia said, I'm not going to repeat it. There's going to be a master of time. After 7 minutes, he or she interrupts the lecture, asks only one thing. Either you ask a question, you make a statement in agreement or disagreement, one of these 3, and then we designate a new master of time. So that's what we're going to do throughout this lecture. And Xenia, I will ask you to be the first master of time, the first time watcher. And here we go with the first 7 minutes. So by ecclesiastical, magisterium, the Catholic Church signifies the task of teaching that by Christ's institution is proper to the college of bishops linked in hierarchical communion with the Pope. Only the Pope and bishops in communion with him make up the magisterium. Now, there are different levels of magisterium as shown in this schedule, which I found on Wikipedia. And so there are different levels you see here. In this talk, I will be focusing on the 4th level of magisterium, the pontifical level. Now, there is, of course, no hint of any magisterium of fragility within the framework of this magisterium. As Jesuit priest Justin Glynn pointed out in 2022, the Magisterium of Fragility is not one of papal documents, but one of lived experiences. Still, it is interesting that it is Pope Francis who proclaims this magisterium within the ordinary teaching of the Church, thus considering it authoritative, but not infallible. This means that in the Catholic Church, something within the lived experiences of fragility has authoritative power for all the faithful. In a document of the International Theological Commission, it is stated that theologians are those members who pursue a deeper understanding of the Word of God and teach that Word in accordance with tradition. And you must know that both magisterial and theological teachings are bound by what we call the sensus fidei, the supernatural appreciation of faith, and also always in conversation with the sensus fidelium, which is the sense of faith deeply rooted in the people of God. Now, recently, theologians have sort of put together the sensus fidei and the sensus fidelium, and they talk now about the sensus fidei fidelium. This could mean that among the faithful, Francis has put a spotlight on those faithful whose lives are marked by the experience of fragility and whose lived experiences give them a different understanding of the faith, thus informing in a new way the sensus fidei. Francis' Magisterium of Fragility should be seen, I think, in the light of this renewed understanding of the sensus fidei fidelium. The lives of disabled people inform our understanding of faith, and this understanding is of magisterial importance. Oh, sorry. So there is a link between the lives of fragile people and the Magisterium of Fragility. Now, what is this Magisterium all about? And here I come to my first point. There we go. Just looking at the time. So the first seeds of this Magisterium may be found in mentions made by Pope John Paul II throughout his pontificate, and one of the more significant being a paragraph of Christe Fidelis Laici, where the lay faithful, you can see an extract of it here, are invited to adopt an attitude which looks upon the sick person and the bearer of a handicap, not simply as an object of the Church, but as an active and responsible participant in the work of evangelization and salvation. Although this paragraph has not received in its time all the attention it deserved, it contains the cornerstone of what is to become the Magisterium of Fragility. People with disabilities have a responsibility in the work of evangelization. They are not mere objects of care. Now, the proper expression, Magisterium of Fragility, is used for the first time, to my knowledge, by Pope Francis during the general audience of the 1st of June in 2022, where he explicitly linked it to the testimony of elderly people when they confidently abandon themselves to the care of others, starting with God's self. Now try to remember the word care. It is going to come back at the end of my talk. Francis evokes this magisterium again on the International Day of People with Disabilities in 2022, and he defines it as a charism by which people with disabilities can enrich the Church. This recognition of a valuable contribution of disabled lives for the Church, because he says they enrich the Church, stands in staunch contrast, I think, with the absence of people with disabilities in Catholic leadership functions. More about that later. And the premises that lays at the heart of this Magisterium of Fragility can be found in the Pope's address to the participants in the Convention for Persons with Disabilities in June 2016, where Francis stated, "Hidden in weakness and fragility are treasures capable of renewing our Christian communities." Now, exactly why these people are treasures and how they enrich the church is coming later in his development. But this is what he said in 2016. In 2017, the Pope gives a new message, and the overall tone of this new message is one of love, inclusion, encounter, and welcome for people with disabilities. Francis says, the Sunday liturgy, 7 minutes. Okay.
7 minutes, I have to stop you. So because I am the first, I am not an expert also in the Roman Catholic theology. So I think that I will go with the maybe statement, an agreement, and maybe not the agreement, but kind of the statement, because I like when you said that this magisterium adds a perspective that people with the disabilities, they are in some way responsible for kind of they have the responsibility for witnessing, for like kind of the activity in a participate in the church. So it's not only because when we speak about Roman Catholic Church, we always they have a very like solid socially oriented theology. So that's like kind of ministering to the people. So they are more focused how to help people, how to support people. But that's kind of the new thing, that the people who need support, they have the responsibility to do that. They have the responsibility to be the leaders.
Indeed.
That's something that I do like.
And it is, thank you for bringing that up. I try to keep the comments to 1 minute, but you've perfectly held that time limit. And something that Professor Silayo said yesterday, that we have the teaching is there, the papers are there, the thinking is there. Now we have to put it into practice. I think there are seeds. We'll see that at the end of the lecture, and it's coming about, but we're not there yet. Okay, thank you, Xenia, to have been the time watcher. Can you designate a new time watcher, please?
So because our today's moderator is Roman Solovi, so the next time watcher is going to be Roman.
Do you accept, Roman?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, let's get on. So in the 2017 speech of message for the people with disabilities, Francis says that he puts really an insistence on participation in the liturgy. He says the liturgy must be able to include them so that the encounter with the risen Lord and with the community itself may be a source of hope and courage in the difficult journey of life. So people with disabilities are called to fully participate in the liturgy. Now, in 2017, the Pope clearly understood the urgency for people with disabilities to participate in the life of the Church, to participation in Eucharistic celebrations, but there is no real space yet for any empowering vision of disability leadership in his message. However, in the last sentence, there may be something of a quiver that hinges in that direction. Indeed, Francis states that people with disabilities may be their own catechists, because by their witness too, he says, they can pass on the faith in a more effective way. So Francis seems to consider the possibility of people with disabilities in a leadership role, but only as catechists for other people with disabilities. It hasn't dawned on him yet that their testimony may be of importance for the Church as a whole, but that is soon to evolve. The 2017 message contains another cornerstone of what is to become the Magisterium of Fragility. Francis says, vulnerability is intrinsic to the essential nature of humankind. In the context of this message, the term vulnerability clearly relates to disability-related vulnerability. And this idea will actually find its way to the Directory for Catechesis in 2020, which states explicitly that vulnerability doesn't prevent anyone from achieving happiness and self-fulfillment. Now, this is very, very important. It means that the lives of people with disabilities are not all about suffering. And I refer back to Brian Brock's introductory talk, where he talked about Stanley Hauerwas and the problem of projection. Indeed, able-bodied persons devaluate the lives of people with disabilities because able-bodied people think that they would be unhappy if they lived that way. So they project their own imagined suffering on the lives of people with disabilities. And this line in the Directory of Catechesis goes exactly against that. It says, vulnerability doesn't prevent anyone from achieving happiness and self-fulfillment. I think this is something very, very important to stress when we are working with people with disabilities. For Christians acquainted with disabilities, the statement that vulnerability is essential only confirms a paradigm of disability advocacy. Indeed, back in 2000 already, Josie Bisek wrote that people have disabilities because people are human, and disability is a natural part of the human state. And even on the World Health Organization's website, you can read that disability is part of being human and is integral to the human experience. So, is there nothing new under the sun? I think there is. In Catholic thought, Francis' insistence on vulnerability and impairment being intrinsic and essential to human nature paves the way for impairment to be understood as part of God's creation and not as a mere consequence of the fall. Of course, Pope Francis doesn't really spell this out, and I must admit that disagreement abounds on this issue amongst Catholic and other theologians. I have seen Peter Maikan among us, and he will surely not agree. Still, the recognition of vulnerability as being essential can be interpreted as being in accordance with God's will. There is a caveat, though. Considering vulnerability as essential does not imply that we shouldn't try everything within our means to improve and facilitate the lives of extremely vulnerable people, including them in all aspects of society. And this idea of inclusion is at the core of the message for the International Day of Persons with Disabilities in 2019. This message is dedicated to the rights for people with disabilities to participate in society through the promotion of a culture of encounter. Christians are called upon to recognize in every person with a disability a unique contribution to the common good through their original life stories. There is an unexpected twist here that underlies the Magisterium of Fragility. The stories of people with disabilities matter. Christians have a task to give voice to those who are discriminated against, because without their voice, the message of the gospel is incomplete. And this task falls to theologians. And though marginalized voices have been heeded to a certain extent due to the narrative turn in practical theology, the voices of people with disabilities, and especially with intellectual disabilities, have gone largely unattended, especially in Catholic theology. This urgency to listen to marginalized voices has come to the fore in the synodal process and has found its way to the conclusive report of the European Continental Assembly, which says only when we listen to the voices that are not often heard can we grow and discern. So we are invited to go against the flow by listening to the counter-narratives of people with disabilities who inform the sensus fidei fidelium.
7 minutes now.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
This comes as a surprise.
Sorry, I was trying to find a moment when
you did well.
interrupt you, but there is no good moment to interrupt anyway. My question is, while I really appreciate and agree with theology and rhetoric behind this Magisterium Fragility, but my question is, how would you think about implementing those concepts in different contexts, not in Western European context, but let's say in countries with low social conditions of life, countries in a war like Ukraine, countries where there are ethnic conflicts, let's say. So what I mean, in many parts of the world, fragility is not as much a matter of being excluded, but just a matter of surviving.
Absolutely.
For the people with disabilities. So how would you connect those realities? That would be a very interesting question for me.
Yeah, and it's a very good and a very pertaining question, a very good question, sorry. I think we sort of touched on this yesterday with Professor Silayo's talk too. Of course, when we look at Francis' words from our disability theological perspective, we are living in the Western world with our Western standards. And I think in our Western world, we are ready to hear this. And actually, much of the visibilization and the awareness on disability is already going on in the Western world. And that is why we can hear this and try to implement it. There has been like about 60 years of advocacy going on before this could happen. And I think the work of people like Professor Silayo in Africa, for example, is absolutely necessary for this kind of magisterium to be able to be heard. So maybe this, I know that if it is a magisterium, it is normally to be implemented in the whole of our planet, on the whole of our planet. Maybe there is quite some work ahead of this to go on. I was in Indonesia, and people there said to me that, well, we don't have the means to implement what you want to create here. And so I think as a whole, you cannot just go to a country and say, this is what you have to do, right? There is grassroots work to be done first. But this grassroots work is going on. And I am sorry, I don't know enough about countries at war to really engage on the Ukrainian context. But as I said yesterday, I have been working with a Congolese student. And this Congolese student is trying to create in Congo, in the village where he is from, a place to gather for people with and without disabilities. So, and his ideas are nurtured by this magisterium of fragility. This doesn't mean that he can go to his village and say, now this is what you have to do, but his ideas are nurtured by it, and it makes him want to create a space where people can come together. And I think that before we can really have people with disabilities in leadership roles, it's this type of grassroots work that is absolutely essential and possible.
Thank you very much. Excellent. I appreciate your answer.
Okay. So could you indicate a new Master
I would
of
like
Time?
to invite to be next Master of Time, Dorothy Tripodi. Dorothy, would you accept this invitation?
I am sorry, but I'm going to have to pass because I have a student coming into my office in 10 minutes, and I could not do it justice, but I do appreciate the honor of being asked.
Thank you.
I'm teaching summer intensive, so I'm in and out. So my apologies.
Okay. Thank you. Then my option B, Alphonse Moss, are you available? Alphonse Moss?
Yes, I'm available. 7 minutes,
Thank you very
right?
much. Thank you.
Okay.
7 minutes starting.
Okay, 7 minutes from now. So we're at this 2020 message where Francis recognizes the importance of regular training. We're actually in this right now, right? Regular training concerning disabilities and the use of inclusive pastoral tools for all priests, seminarians, religious people, catechists, and pastoral workers. Inclusiveness starts with language, hence the importance in the Magisterium of Fragility to no longer speak about them, but rather about us. Again, I refer to Brian Brock, where he challenged the charity model. The charity model always wants to, we able-bodied care for them, the disabled, and Francis says, no, it's not them, it's us, we're all together. When it comes to active participation, Pope Francis' thought has matured since 2017. Before all, he strongly reaffirms the rights of persons with disabilities to receive the sacraments, like all other members of the Church. They are entitled to all the sacraments, full stop. He says, o tutti o nessuno, the sacraments are for all or for none. In his 2020 message, the Pope also clearly states that people with disabilities wish to become active subjects of pastoral ministry and not simply its recipients. This evolution is confirmed in the new directory for catechesis, which says now that people with disabilities can be catechists and not just can be catechists for themselves, right? So Francis no longer limits catechetical ministry by people with disabilities to other people with disabilities. Their testimony is effective for all. Their stories matter. Now, how can the Church become a home for people with disabilities? This question lies at the heart of the 2021 message, the International Day of People with Disabilities. Building on the universal idea of friendship with Jesus, the Pope makes it clear that in our common home, everyone has a part to play. By virtue of the sacrament of baptism, everyone is called to make a contribution. For Francis, this contribution can be manifold, but there is one mission he entrusts specifically to persons with disabilities. He writes, "Prayer is a mission, accessible to everyone, and I would like to entrust that mission in a particular way to you." And here you is people with disabilities. Francis is, of course, not the first Pope in recent history to encourage prayer and to invite vulnerable persons to pray. But the difference with his predecessors is that Francis claims that the Church needs the prayers of vulnerable persons. They seem to contribute in a unique way to the prayer of the Church. Why this is true remains a mystery, but still, something of God's glory seems to become present only through the prayer of vulnerable persons. That is why Francis states that the prayers of people with disabilities matter, Moreover, they are needed. Finally, according to Francis, the Church needs every person, regardless of abilities, for the fulfillment of her mission at the service of the gospel. Everyone, regardless of abilities, has the joyful task of proclaiming the gospel. In 2022, he writes, sharing the gospel, in fact, is not a duty entrusted only to some, but an absolute necessity for all those who have encountered Jesus and enjoyed his friendship, end quote. I attract your attention to what I call a paradigm shift. Over the years, I see an evolution in the conception of participation of people with disabilities in the life of the Church. At the very first time when they are mentioned, the Church talks about their contribution to make. We have seen how John Paul II talks about responsibility, but now with Pope Francis, people with disabilities have a duty to fulfill, to share the gospel. Duty is a very strong word. And the question now is, how do we help them to fulfill their duty? From this point of view, recognizing the explicit witness to the Lord's saving love through the life of persons with disabilities becomes a sacred challenge for all Christians in the Church. The very notions of responsibility and duty beg for a more complete understanding of the need for disability leadership. As I said, the Magisterium of Fragility is a work in progress, but we can flesh it out in several characteristics that seem to define it. They are here. It's about vulnerability being essential. The stories of people with disabilities matter. It's not them, it's us. O tutti onosino, the sacraments are for all. Participation, contribution, responsibility, duty, and the prayers of people with disabilities matter. They are needed to assure the mission of the Church. As theologians, we are invited to pursue a deeper understanding of the Magisterium of Fragility. Very few of us have gone down that path yet. Still, theologians have been reflecting on frailty since long before the development of Francis' Magisterium. In the following paragraph, I would like to engage the conversation between disability theologians and this new form of magisterium. Here we are. I will develop 2 points. A short point on leadership, power and love, ability and theology, and the second one on theological reflection on dementia and discipleship. Now, here's my first point. Christians are invited to follow a poor and powerless Jesus.
That is 7 minutes.
Oh, okay. There you go.
And now, if I understand, I make a statement or ask a question, correct?
Yeah, you make a positive or a negative statement, or you ask a question. Yeah.
Well, I have nothing but positive thoughts and things to say about your content so far, so I appreciate that. I was struck by the idea of inclusiveness. It starts with, it's not them, but us, and that concept. But I see a paradox here, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little about that. The idea that there's a unity, if I understand right, that the inclusion of those with disability is essential and valuable and necessary, even some of the language. And so we should change our lexicon to a not them and us, but us altogether. However, the paradox is, how does that happen when we're in the process of trying to be inclusive? Even in your lecture, you talk about the paradigm shift where they are included, where they have responsibility, where we must appreciate their contribution as necessary and so forth. So Can you talk a little bit about that, at least that paradox, or maybe I'm missing something?
No, there is a paradox, and it's going to take me a little to dwell on that. So I would like to keep that question for the end of the session, because otherwise it's going to interrupt too long. I think it also goes with this saying that we are all a bit disabled. It's the same line of thinking. So you're absolutely right to underscore the paradox, and we'll dwell upon that at the end, if that is okay for you.
That's great.
Okay, so could you indicate and designate a new time watcher?
Okay. Rastislav, good to see you. It's been a long time. Will you accept an invitation to be the timer?
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you very much. So here we were with this phrase of Henry Nouwen, Dutch Catholic priest, and although we don't usually count him among disability theologians, I think he was one. He said Christians are invited to follow a poor and powerless Jesus, and every time they give in to the temptation of exercising control and power, they let themselves be led astray. So this is Henry Nouwen reflecting on leadership in 1989. Nouwen wonders what makes the temptation of power so irresistible, and concludes that, quote, power offers an easy substitute for the hard task of love, end quote. So according to Nouwen, it seems easier to be God than to love God, easier to control people than to love people. Now, the balance between power and love is a delicate one, and we would do well to remember the words of Martin Luther King when he said, I quote, "What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." Hence, thinking about fragility in terms of magisterium and leadership must include a thorough reconsideration of how we as Christians understand power. Now, I too believe that love cannot do without power. Still, people, among whom many Christians, have always been tempted to replace love with power. This explains, according to Henry Nouwen, and I quote him at length, that the long and painful history of the Church is the history of people ever and again tempted to choose power over love, control over the cross, being a leader over being led. Those who resisted this temptation to the end, and thereby give us hope, are the true saints, end quote. The core of Christian leadership, says Nouwen, is the ability to be led rather than to lead. It is a leadership of vulnerability and humility in which authoritative control is confidently abandoned in favor of interdependent love. Surely the leadership that Nouwen is talking about has got very little to do with the leadership of political leaders at the J7. When reflecting on disability leadership and the magisterium of fragility within the Church, it is important to take this into account. It is not only about offering people with disabilities the possibility to participate in leadership roles and to hold strategic positions in the hierarchy of the Church. Of course, it is that too, and a lot of people with disabilities aim at being there. Still, the core question for me is about how this leadership is exercised and whose model we want to follow. Would people with disabilities provide for better role models than able-bodied people? Some might not. It seems to me that this is not the point. Rather, the lived experiences of people with disabilities and with cognitive challenges need to be taken seriously when it comes to preparing future leaders in our church and their theological education, whether these leaders be abled or disabled. I was struck by Nouwen's emphasis on the need for more strenuous theological reflection on the issue of Christian leadership. He writes, I'm not going to read all this, but he says that theological reflection will allow us to discern critically where we are being led. Real theological thinking is hard to find in the practice of ministry. That's a big critique to my discipline. He says the task of theologians is to raise human consciousness to the knowledge of God's gentle guidance. And God's presence, he says, is often a hidden presence. A Christian leader is called to help people to hear that voice. Now, I believe that the loving voice of God also speaks through the vulnerable presence of people with disabilities, however profound these disabilities. Learning to heed that voice and reflect theologically upon it is the task of theologians wanting to put into practice the Magisterium of Fragility. This implies learning to listen to the stories of people with disabilities and scrutinize their words to discern the theological implications of what they have to say. This is already happening here and there. I cite two theologians, one in Pretoria, Julian Muller in South Africa, and the other one is Etienne Grieux at Faculté Loyola in Paris. And both of them have been putting into practice this listening to vulnerable people. Julian Muller listens to people who are sick. Etienne Grieux and his research seminar listens to people who live in poverty, great poverty. And both of them have developed a method of listening to these people and discerning what theological implications there are in the words of these vulnerable, fragile people. I have a slide with the procedures of both theologians. I'm not going to get into that, but I think it is interesting to see that in the global north and the global south, and maybe even east and west, there are people trying to discern theologically on hearing the voice of marginalized voices. Now, among disability theologians who already operate that way, I count Scottish theologian John Swinton, notably with his work on dementia. And this brings me to my second point in this section.
Excuse me, but 7 minutes are over.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I mean, so far it's a very, very insightful talk. And actually, my question would be precisely about the last slide that you showed about Müller and Grieux. The three key points that you highlighted were that we need to listen, and then there was also the need to resonate what we hear and reformulate these interpretations in the light of interpretative traditions. This is on the right side of the slide where you describe the approach of Grieux. I'm kind of intrigued by the idea of reformulation. I mean, we will listen stories, we as theologians analyze them, but what does it mean in this context to reformulate? Like, do we change something, or what does this mean in this approach?
Now, I'm very lucky to be part of this research seminar that has been going on now for nearly 10 years in Paris. And when you go out in the field and listen to people, this is people that live in extreme poverty, right? The words they say are charged with meaning, but you cannot just take their words and throw them out in the open and say to people, this is what these people have to say. Our task, we think, is to discuss these words together and confront these words to our own tradition. So we read the founders, we read theological works and confront the words of these people with what is said already in our tradition. And then we reformulate in a way that what this person has said about his life, about the text, about his experience or her experience cannot necessarily be full of meaning for any person or in any context. So we reformulate the words confronted with what tradition has already taught us and say, these are the insights that we can go out with and say, maybe there are other ways to reading the biblical text. I could go into examples, but it's going to take me another 10 minutes. So feel free to contact me, and then I'll give you some examples of how reading the text with people that live in extreme poverty has, for example, changed my way of understanding some parts of the gospel. And so I'm going, when I'm doing that, when I'm rereading the gospel through their lens, I'm reformulating.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your response.
Okay, can you designate a new time watcher?
Yes, I would like to ask my colleague from Kiev, Denis Kondyuk. Denis, would you like to take this role?
So I just comment in 7 minutes, right?
Yeah, in 7 minutes,
Okay,
please interrupt me with a comment or a question. Okay, there we go. So, theological reflection on dementia and discipleship. What Swinton says about dementia, I think, can easily be transported to other forms of disability, also to acquired disability, which is why I have decided to include this section in this talk. Combining old age and cognitive disability, people with dementia are among the most vulnerable and fragile societies. But however diminished and confused, they remain members of our parishes and faith communities, and as such are very much the concern of the Magisterium of Fragility. They too are called to actively participate in the life of the Church. Their stories too matter. Now, in what way is the Church concerned with people who have dementia? This is the question that John Swinton asks his ministry students in a provocative article published in 2020. And the assumption of most students, he says, is that things concerning dementia, well, that falls under the category of pastoral care. And so they answer, oh, our pastoral team can take care of them. According to John Swinton, this is a fundamental error of categorization. He makes the claim that older people with disability are foremost disciples with a vocation. Pastoral care is, of course, important, but discipleship and vocation are essential aspects of the Christian life, which we must support throughout life. It is amazing how John Swinton's counterframing completely changes the way we approach persons with dementia. As long as they are considered sick and in need, we can be satisfied with our pastoral team going to visit them, like in Matthew 25. But if we recognize them as disciples with a vocation, the aim of our visit will change. How can we discern the vocation of a person with Alzheimer's disease? We have a duty to try and understand what it is God is calling this person to, and what it means to be a disciple with a vocation for somebody who no longer has the cognitive capacity to discern that call. We can hold exactly the same line of reasoning when we think of individuals with intellectual disabilities or people who have acquired disabilities. What is God calling these people to? Now, rethinking the mission of older people in the Church is nothing new. Back in '98, the Pontifical Council for the Laity published a document promoting the mission of older people, and the whole dynamic of intergenerational pastoral care has grown out of this reflection. Now, according to this document, it is the duty of the Church to instill older people with an awareness of their task in transmitting the gospel. It says, far from being passive recipients of the Church pastoral care, older people are irreplaceable apostles. And I've highlighted this phrase because I think that irreplaceable apostles is a very nice way of putting it, not only for people with elderly people, it goes for all of us, all these vulnerable persons. The document insists on the active participation of older people in the life of the Church. However, this active participation is limited to those elderly people in good health and lucid as can be. We're in 1998, so we are way ahead of the Magisterium of Fragility. There seems to be no space for the active participation of people with dementia. And this is where John Swinton's reflection comes in. Because Swinton doesn't just stretch the idea of older person's mission a little further. His claim is not about finding something to do for people who are alone or ill. Swinton invites us to think theologically about the meaning of God's call when verbal communication and the ability to make informed choices seems to be lacking. In so doing, he shifts our understanding of the notion of vocation. Now, I don't know what the word vocation brings up in your idea, but very often people see it as a consented response to a call, a freely consented response to God's call. Swinton says no. Formulated in that way, vocation would not be accessible to everyone, especially if cognitive capacities are impaired. Instead, Swinton suggests, and I quote, vocation is a participation in something bigger than oneself. It is a call from God to participate in the things of God. Vocation is perhaps best framed as an aspect of God's providence, end quote. The theologian inscribes vocation within providence, and providence is then understood as a powerful counter-narrative that ensures that in the midst of fallenness, brokenness, suffering, and confusion of God's creation, the beauty of God's hopeful story is not lost. And Swinton says, every single person can participate in that beautiful story. Vocation
and the 7 minutes are gone.
Okay, that was quickly. Go ahead.
Well, it's rather a comment that I think it's important to emphasize this participation as the main form of both knowing and also sharing knowledge with others. And as you shared, that participation changes our approach to what discipleship is and how can we learn from others without taking this kind of didactic or teaching approach to everything related to the church and discipleship.
Yeah, that's a very nice comment you made. Thank you. I see that we are nearly getting to the hour, so I'm going to just go through the rest of the PowerPoint without time masters, because otherwise it's going really to be too long. We won't have time for questions and answers. I think I have another 5 minutes to go, well, maybe 7. So here we go, full speed ahead. So Swinton doesn't see vocation within the framework of a reasoned, freely consented response to a call, and he doesn't see it as a personal career plan or personal fulfillment either. He says vocation is participation, not personal fulfillment. And every human being and every Christian has the vocation to respond to God's call and to participate in God's story. And each vocation is necessary for the upbuilding of the church. And this brings us back to the Magisterium of Fragility. If we consider, If we consider participation in terms of vocation, then caring for one another is certainly a fundamental aspect of our vocation. I told you to keep the word caring in mind. So receiving, this then raises a crucial point. Being a recipient of care is an essential aspect of the caring for one another process. Receiving care is not degrading or shameful. On the contrary, it is a profound reflection of God's love for vulnerable and dependent human beings. This is fundamental, not just for people with dementia or intellectual disability. It is essential for each and every one of us. It is essential for all people with acquired disability who think that now they are useless. Being a recipient of care can be a vocation. Joyce Ann Mercer, professor of practical theology at Yale Divinity, calls this reciprocity in care a receptive dependent mode. This kind of dependency may not be an easy position, she says. I quote her, may not be an easy position for people schooled in cultural norms of self-sufficiency, autonomy, and individualism. Still, the call to receive care reminds the rest of the faith community that we are created for relational interdependence rather than self-sufficiency. Now, she talks about older adults, but we can say this for any person dependent on care. God's call for older adults to receive care from others is also a call to experience the care and the presence of God. And I think that learning to faithfully receive care is another element that could be added to the Magisterium of Fragility. If anyone meets the Pope, please tell him. The Magisterium of Fragility may become a cornerstone in the Church's teaching, but how can we put it into practice? In my final paragraph, we'll try to see how faith communities in France, and this is important because it's really context related, how faith communities in France are invited to offer safe spaces for vulnerable individuals and how their lives remain of importance for the Church, offering a very different kind of leadership than what we usually imagine when we think about these things. So from teaching to practice. So the teaching of Francis on fragility is not based on theoretical speculation. It is a very experience-induced reflection on what fragility and vulnerability can mean for church and also for theology. But by framing his reflections in terms of magisterium, Francis obliges the whole of the Roman Catholic Church to recognize the authority of what is expressed here. The magisterium opens, I think, a path to an effective disability leadership. Now, how is this magisterium lived out on the floor? There are several examples of experiences where people with disabilities lead in communities, take initiatives, lead in celebrations. I'm afraid that, well, these are still isolated examples, but I also believe that by getting them known, by sharing what is happening, theologians can bring these initiatives into dialogue with the Magisterium of Fragility, reinforcing its credibility. So I sincerely hope that this inspires communities worldwide to put into practice the authoritative teachings of fragility. I would just like to show a few examples of Catholic community life in France and how the Magisterium of Fragility is already implemented. For the interpreters, I will not give the personal level. So at grassroots level, you see here a group of nuns. They are called Petites Sœurs Disciples de l'Agneau, which is a contemplative order which offers young women with Down syndrome the possibility of realizing their religious vocation. It was founded in 1985. The community was erected in 1999 as a religious institute by the Archbishop of Bourges. And they have about 16 nuns now, 12 of whom have Down syndrome. And here is another example. This is a small living unit in Dinard in the west of France, where 5 men also with Down syndrome live together, and they are very active at parish level. They lead a prayer service twice per week in the local church. If we as church want to take into consideration Francis' Magisterium of Fragility, then we must take very seriously the vocation of people with disabilities. Now, on a diocesan level, I want to point out the synod in Poitiers in 2003, where they have entrusted altar service to people with intellectual disabilities, because it says this shows the face of a church that is at once fragile, radiant, and full of hope, the face of a church that welcomes and gives itself. And I'm very happy to tell you that the church, the Diocese of Poitiers, has ordained its first acolytes with Down syndrome in 2022. So things are moving very slowly, but they are moving. On a national level, it might be interesting to note this. The Christian Office for People with Disabilities has started an initiative where people are invited, all people are invited to learn to pray, guided by people with disabilities. The website of this initiative features testimonies of people with disabilities, meditations, and prayers. Then on a synodal level, there is the whole dynamic around the church is our home. The intention to take seriously disability leadership became a tangible reality during the early stages of the Synod on Synodality, where for the first time ever, people with different types of disabilities have been invited to share their ideas and suggestions coming together in Rome. So there have been 2 listening sessions organized by 2 Vatican dicasteries, and some of the findings have found their way to the Instrumentum Laboris for the universal phase of the Synod, which asks, how can we create moments of effective participation in a co-responsible mission? And the Synod has two months ago, I think, issued a document called An Unlimited Joy, where it insists on the importance of co-responsibility. Now, co-responsibility is not just putting people with disabilities in high spots, right? I think something of co-responsibility, and I'm taking back this picture of Adam and Caleb and Bishop Anne, because I really think it's nearly prophetical. Just a minute, right? It says a lot, this picture, about co-responsibility. It's not about getting able-bodied people out of the picture. It's about exercising power all together. And that is why this picture is so important. Bishop Anne and Adam are holding the cross together, but the picture wouldn't be complete without Caleb in it. But it wouldn't be complete without Adam either. Only with all 3 protagonists in the picture can this photo be used as a metaphor on how power is to be exercised in the church. The bishop exercising co-responsibility with the people of all abilities, all valuable, all with a big level of valuability. And I thank you, Christina Gangemi. I don't know if she's with us, but she coined in the conception of valuability, and I think it's a very, very important way of looking at leadership. Now, and this is my last 3 minutes. What about the pontifical level? Talking about disability and fragility in terms of magisterium and leadership provides an empowering counterframe against the objectification of dependent people. This is true for any person with a disability. If we in the Catholic Church consider the valuability of the lives of these people, their guidance may be of a very different kind than what is usually considered by the concept of leadership. It has nothing to do with clinging to power when one is riddled with Parkinson's disease. The sight of John Paul II's tremors sparked controversy and mockery worldwide. And yet, the images of John Paul II trembling in his wheelchair, surrounded by staff, delicately cared for, clothed in dignity, sent a very powerful message to the world. In the Catholic Church, disability, disease, and extreme vulnerability are no obstacles to full participation and recognition of a person's dignity and valuability. At least that is what these images could have conveyed had we known and trusted the Magisterium of Fragility. Okay, I'll forget about the question. Time to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Talitha. It's good that we can come now can go to the question session. We have 2 questions in the chat. I will probably read it. I'm Erson Sirigar from West Kalimantan, Indonesia. I noticed in the article who is the right leader model that can be used for leaders with disabilities. My question, can the prophet Amos be a leadership model for Christian leaders with disabilities, considering that the prophet Amos, when he was expelled by Imam Amaziah, he was not afraid because he was clearly aware that he had a clear call from God. Second, when the identity or background of his life degraded, Prophet Amos was even able to face it. This means that he is able to accept himself well. This is the success of the Prophet Amos in his service. Thank you, Talitha. Would you comment?
Yeah.
And yeah.
I think it's a nice way of putting it. Why not? I haven't given it any thought looking at the Prophet Amos as a model. I'm always afraid that when we try to use the Bible and then take it out of context and use it in our context to find models. However, what you say here about Amos having a clear call, being and even when he was, how do you say it, when life was degraded, he came to accept it. This is, yeah, it could be a model. I'm not going to say yes or no, because I really would have to look into it more deeply. And as all this is recorded, I wouldn't say any stupid things for the rest of eternity, but it surely is an interesting idea. So thank you for bringing this up. And I invite you to contact me by mail and see if we can do something with this. But certainly an interesting idea.
Okay, and one more question. Can we enjoy a God who is overloaded and needs carers to experience divine from a human perspective? As a recipient of full-time care, I remember carers have complicated lives, have bad days, forget my interventions and exact processes, but care does give the experience of receiving from others as a human Christ did. The question.
Can we enjoy a God who is overloaded and needs carers? Alex, are you talking here about the disabled God? We must be very careful, right? But at least in Jesus Christ, I think we can say that Jesus Christ is with us in all these difficulties, and at least in Jesus Christ, God is certainly vulnerable. Care does give the experience of receiving from others as the human Christ did. The thing in care is that it's about giving and receiving, and if one of these dimensions is lacking, then of course there's something wrong with the care. So yeah, thank you for that comment, and thank you for taking into account that carers too have complicated lives. It's not always easy. I'm quite impressed that you can say this, Alex, because people who are suffering are not always capable of acknowledging that. So thank you for bringing this up.
Yes, Alex's voice, it's a lot about patience, both human and divine. Thanks.
Yeah, it surely is. And luckily, we have a merciful and a very, very, very patient God, whom we may cry against when everything goes wrong.
Okay, dear friends. Oh, one more question. Paul.
Yeah, and then we have to. I have gone way over time.
Yeah, Paul, can you please ask your question? Maybe that would be the last one.
Sorry, I take out a bit of more time from you. The question is a very simple one. I haven't read much disability theology from the Catholic theology point of view. So I'm very interested to know, how does Catholic theology impact or shapes the way we construct disability theology? I know you have been using, you are trying to illustrate that the role that the Magisterium play in somehow constructing the disability theology, by laying down the guideline. But to me, it seems that most of the guidelines seems to be share a lot of commonality with other types of disability theology. So I just want to know, because Catholic theology, with its rich heritage and vast doctrinal coverage, they have something very unique to offer in constructing disability theology. So I'm keen to know what is those things that makes a difference.
Yeah, I think it's not. I'm not sure that it's that you should say that we have something unique to offer. I think a lot of disability theology is constructed together, but there is a distinctive Catholic voice. And so I have here insisted on Magisterium. Looking at the lives of the saints could be another contribution. Don't get me wrong. I'm not at all saying that Catholic disability theology is competing with disability theology. It is completing the discussion. It's really a conversation that is going on. And so looking at the life of the saints may be another. There's a very, very strong sense of tradition in the Catholic Church. And when we engage in the conversation around disability theology, we come with this whole background. And I think it's interesting. It's just completing the conversation. Does that reply? Does that answer? Sorry, does that answer your question?
What I'm trying to say is, when we do constructing a theology, or any theology for that matter, we normally follow a theological methodology. We have a theological method that we go by. We start with some kind of starting point, some kind of presupposition, then we follow some orientating questions, that at the end we have a theology that is so-called, that is both fit into our overall theology, that's governed by a tradition. In your case, it's a Catholic theology. So I just want to know a little bit of how a Catholic theologian construct a theology of disability in a way that's slightly different, or give it a bit of twist, so to speak. I mean, than let's say Protestant or Orthodox. I mean, this is not something directly related to what you're saying, but I thought that.
I think it really is in not necessarily within the method, but in the references we use. Our next speaker, Peter Maikan, comes from Orthodox tradition, so he'll be using other references than I would do when I'm trying to found and to substantivate my thought. It's not really in the method; it's really in the references. Can I just, Roman? There is the last question is a very very actual one. What do I think about Biden and the fact that that he's not considered sufficiently able to be a president? That's a very very difficult one, and it depends on what kind of leadership you're expecting, right? If we are expecting the leadership in the way that politicians are exercising their power, maybe Joe Biden has come to a part in where he's not sufficiently healthy anymore to go through the strains of such leadership. But I don't think that his leadership role is over. His role as a president may be over, but there may be something else in what he is living and how he is influencing society, and that shows something different than the kind of leadership that we want him to exercise as a politician.
Okay, thank you, Talitha. We need to stop now because we need to have some break between sessions, and there are still 2 more another sessions coming. But just as a conclusion, I just would like to say thank you very much, because I was personally quite impressed by this address of Francisc that was published in Observatorio Romano. I wasn't aware about the document. It's quite enriching and challenging, and I think it's very good, as you mentioned, complementarian approach to Protestant and Orthodox, but specifically Protestant theologies of disability. It's enriching, it's challenging. It comes from a bit different ecclesiological tradition, but it brings balance to our theological views on disability. So I really appreciate your profound insights and your generous spirit in accepting our invitation and being that generous and outgoing and friendly and hospitable with us during this session. Thank you very much. I hope in the future we will have many more encounters and maybe some joint projects. We hope for that.
No, I hope.
Yeah, we want to develop this theological discussion